The fishermen called them the lights. Not a fancy name, but the right one. For decades, crews working the night waters off Southern California have watched glowing objects rise from beneath the Pacific. They hover silently above the waves, then they drop back into the black depths. Some said the sightings were just sea life glowing in the dark, or maybe military tests. Others were not so sure. Navy sonar operators began picking up huge underwater craft. These things moved at speeds that seemed impossible. The whispers grew louder. Something was down there, far below the ocean floor, operating with tools that seemed centuries ahead of our own. The Pacific Ocean floor off California hides some of the deepest valleys and strangest ground on Earth. These waters have seen odd things since long before satellites mapped the seafloor, long before submarines explored its canyons. Native Chumash tribes spoke of beings coming from the channel waters, the waters between the mainland and the northern islands. Spanish explorers in the 1700s wrote about lights beneath their ships, lights that followed them for hours. By the early 1900s, reports came more often and with more details. The pattern was always the same. Objects entered and left the water with almost no splash. They moved at wild speeds below the surface, and they acted nothing like any known ship or natural thing. The term UFO usually makes people think of craft flying across the sky, but researchers have turned their focus to what they call USOs, unidentified submerged objects. The difference matters. Aerial UFOs might be explained as weird weather or test planes, but objects working underwater present different problems. Water is thick. It fights against movement in ways air does not. The pressure at depth crushes normal submarines. The speeds reported for these objects often top 150 knots underwater. That should create bubbles and shock waves, waves that would tear any known craft apart. Yet witnesses describe silent, smooth movement. No visible engines or propellers. California's coast provides a perfect place for such activity, if one believes the reports. The Santa Catalina Channel separates the mainland from Catalina Island. It drops to depths over 3,000 feet. The San Clemente Basin drops even deeper. These underwater valleys offer hiding places and access to the open Pacific. Naval bases dot the coastline from San Diego to Point Mugu. Submarines patrol these waters all the time. Shipping lanes cross the area. If something wanted to watch human sea activity while staying hidden, this stretch of ocean would work perfectly. The modern wave of sightings began during the 1940s. Naval personnel along the coast during and after World War II reported craft entering the water near San Diego and Long Beach. Some accounts came from trained watchers, men who had spent years at sea, men who knew the difference between a whale, a submarine, and something else. In 1947, the same year, Kenneth Arnold saw his famous flying saucers near Mount Rainier. Fishermen off Santa Monica reported a disc-shaped object. It came up from the water. It circled their boat 3 times, then it went under without making any waves. The reports piled up slowly. A Coast Guard cutter would log strange sonar contacts. A fishing boat would report lights following them beneath the surface. Navy pilots would see objects entering the water at high speed near San Clemente Island. Each event alone could be explained away. Together they pointed to something steady and planned. By the 1950s, certain spots had gained bad reputations among those who worked the water. The area between Point Dume and the Channel Islands became known as a hot zone. Crews avoided talking about what they saw. They feared being laughed at, or worse. But privately, among themselves, they shared stories and wondered what lay beneath. The first well-documented event happened in July 1951. The crew of the Point Sur, a Navy transport ship, was heading south from San Francisco toward San Diego. Around 7 p.m., as the ship passed the California coast near San Luis Obispo, the radar operator picked up multiple contacts moving fast beneath the surface. The objects showed up on sonar as well. This ruled out air problems. Captain Ralph Croft ordered the ship to change course and check it out. For the next 2 hours, the crew tracked between 3 and 5 objects. They moved at speeds over 100 knots, far faster than any submarine of that time. What made the Point Sur meeting important was the number of witnesses and the quality of records. Over 30 crew members saw the radar and sonar tracks. Some watched from the deck as glowing trails in the water marked where the objects passed below. One officer described seeing a faint glow beneath the surface. It paced the ship, then it sped away toward deeper water. The Navy classified the event right away. Crew members were ordered not to talk about what they had seen, but rumors spread. Researchers later got hold of parts of the ship's log that had been declassified. The parts confirmed the basic facts. The objects had been real, they had been tracked on multiple systems, and they had moved in ways that no known tool could explain. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the reports kept coming. Commercial airline pilots flying coastal routes reported seeing objects rise from the ocean and climb fast into the sky. Fishermen described disc-shaped craft hovering just above the waves, then silently dropping beneath the surface. In 1960, the crew of a tuna boat working waters off Baja California watched a metal sphere, maybe 30 feet across. It came up from the water, about 200 yards from their boat. The sphere hovered for nearly a minute, rotating slowly, before sinking back into the ocean. The fishermen noted that the water around the object glowed with a green light, and the sphere itself looked perfectly smooth, no visible seams or marks. The frequency of sightings during this period troubled those who paid attention. A pattern was forming that could not be ignored. Certain crew members became known among their peers as magnets for these encounters. They would see the objects multiple times over their careers, always in the same general areas. One fisherman, named Robert Hayes, reported 5 separate sightings between 1958 and 1967, all within a 10-mile radius of Catalina Island. Each time he described similar characteristics: silent craft, smooth surfaces, and an eerie ability to slip beneath the waves without disturbing the water. Hayes kept detailed logs of his encounters. He noted the time of day, the weather conditions, the depth of the water, and any unusual equipment malfunctions. His records showed that his compass would spin wildly during sightings. His radio would pick up strange interference, a low humming that seemed to pulse in regular intervals. Other fishermen in the area reported identical experiences. Their logs matched Hayes's almost perfectly. This suggested the interference was not random, but a byproduct of whatever powered these objects. In 1962, a research vessel from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography was conducting a survey off La Jolla. The team was mapping the ocean floor using side-scan sonar. Around 2 a.m., the equipment began showing massive returns at a depth of 4,000 feet. The technician operating the sonar called over the lead researcher. What they saw on the screen defied explanation. Multiple objects, each roughly 40 to 50 feet long, were moving in formation. The sonar painted a clear picture. The objects maintained perfect spacing. Like a military patrol, they moved at constant speed for nearly 20 minutes before suddenly accelerating and vanishing from the sonar range. The research team documented everything. They took photographs of the sonar screen. They recorded the exact coordinates, and they noted the time and conditions. When they returned to port, they submitted their findings to the institution, but were told the data likely showed a school of large fish, possibly whales. The researchers disagreed. They had been tracking marine life for years. What they had seen moved too fast, too precisely, and at a depth where few large animals traveled, but their objections were dismissed. The incident was filed away and largely forgotten. One of the best accounts came from a Navy pilot named William Blackmore. In 1963, Blackmore was flying a training run off the coast near Santa Barbara. He saw what he first thought was a submarine on the surface. As he dropped lower for a closer look, he realized the object was hovering about 10 feet above the water. It was tube-shaped, about 60 feet long, with a metal finish that reflected the afternoon sun. Before Blackmore could radio his position, the object dropped into the water, barely a splash, and disappeared from view. He circled the area for several minutes but saw nothing more. When he reported the sighting to his bosses, he was told to file a written report and not discuss the event. Years later, after leaving the Navy, Blackmore went public with his story. He said he remained sure he had seen tools far beyond anything in the American military. By the 1970s, the mystery had caught the eye of civilian researchers. Groups like the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization started collecting reports from the California coast. They found patterns that military investigators either missed or chose to ignore. The sightings grouped around certain places. The Santa Catalina Channel showed the most activity. Objects were most often seen during early evening or before dawn. Many witnesses reported the same things: silent operation, no visible exhaust or engines, rapid speed, and the ability to move between air and water without any trouble. These civilian groups began compiling databases. They cross-referenced Navy logs when they could get them. They interviewed fishermen and recreational boaters. They spoke with harbor masters and Coast Guard personnel. A picture emerged that was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The activity was not random, it followed patterns. Seasonal variations showed increased sightings during summer months when more boats were on the water, when more eyes were watching. But the objects also appeared during winter storms, when few vessels dared venture out. This suggested the sightings were not simply a function of observer presence, but reflected actual increases in activity. One researcher, a former Navy officer named Marcus Webb, devoted years to studying the phenomenon. Webb had served on destroyers in the Pacific during the 1960s. He had personally witnessed 2 underwater contacts that could not be explained. After leaving the service, he dedicated himself to collecting every report he could find. He traveled up and down the California coast, speaking with anyone who claimed to have seen something unusual. By 1975, he had compiled over 400 separate accounts, each vetted for credibility, each containing specific details that could be verified. Webb noticed something the official investigators had missed. The objects seemed to cluster around certain underwater features, particularly areas where the ocean floor dropped sharply, where deep canyons cut into the continental shelf. The San Clemente Basin appeared in his data again and again. So did the waters near Santa Cruz Island and the deep channel west of Point Conception. These areas shared common traits: extreme depth, complex underwater terrain, and relative isolation from shipping lanes. If someone wanted to establish a hidden base, these locations would be ideal. Webb also documented a disturbing trend. Witnesses who reported multiple sightings often experienced health problems afterward: headaches that lasted for days, nausea that appeared without cause, and in some cases, temporary memory loss. Several fishermen described gaps in their recollection, hours that they could not account for. They would remember seeing an object, then suddenly find themselves miles from where they had been, with no memory of how they got there. Webb suspected these were not coincidences, but effects of proximity to whatever technology the objects used. Some researchers said the objects were using underwater bases, long-term or semi-permanent places hidden in the deep valleys off the coast. The theory made sense. If these craft were visiting Earth from somewhere else, they would need a place to work from. The deep ocean offered hiding spots from human eyes. Water would block radar and satellite watching. The vast, unexplored parts of the Pacific could hide structures that might never be found. Critics pointed out that no physical proof of such bases had ever been found. Defenders noted that humanity had explored less than 5% of the ocean floor. Anything built in the deeper valleys would be nearly invisible to current tools. The underwater base theory got unexpected support from an odd source. In 1973, a marine biologist named Sarah Thornton was doing research on deep-sea animals off the coast near San Clemente Island. Using a robot sub with cameras, Thornton was filming the ocean floor at about 2,800 feet down. The robot's camera caught something unexpected. For roughly 20 seconds, the footage showed what looked like a structured surface, smooth and geometric. Unlike any natural rock shape, the edges were too straight, the angles too exact. Before Thornton could move the robot for a better look, the device lost power. It had to be brought back up. When she reviewed the footage with co-workers, opinions split. Some thought it was just an unusual rock formation. Others believed she had filmed something man-made. Thornton tried to return to the site several times over the next months, but navigation gear in that area proved unreliable. Her funding ran out before she could mount a bigger trip. The footage exists in her personal files, but it has never been fully studied. Skeptics dismiss it as a natural formation filmed at an angle that made it look fake. Believers point to the geometric shapes and suggest it needs more study. The debate remains open. The pace of sightings jumped during the 1980s and 1990s. Naval activity off California grew. More personnel meant more possible witnesses. In 1989, the crew of the USS New Orleans, a large transport ship, tracked multiple underwater objects while doing exercises west of San Diego. The sonar contacts moved at speeds over 80 knots and did moves that should have been impossible for any submarine. When the ship's commander tried to get close to one of the contacts, it sped away and disappeared off the sonar screen. The event was logged, but never officially explained. What the official report did not mention was what happened next. 3 crew members on deck watch claimed they saw something surface briefly, about 500 yards off the port side. It was dark. The sea was rough, but all 3 men insisted they saw a large, dark shape break the surface. It remained visible for perhaps 5 seconds. Then it sank back down. They described it as triangular, with rounded edges, and a surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When they reported what they had seen, they were told to keep it quiet. The incident was never added to the official log. Similar encounters became more common as the decades progressed. In 1993, a submarine on patrol detected acoustic signatures that matched no known vessel. The sounds were recorded and later analyzed by experts. What they found confused them. The audio contained frequencies that seemed artificially generated, but the pattern made no sense. It was not sonar, not communication in any recognizable form, just a series of pulses and tones that repeated in complex sequences. Some researchers who later heard the recordings suggested it might be a form of communication, but between what and whom, no one could say. The military's response to these incidents remained frustratingly vague. When pressed, officials would acknowledge that personnel sometimes reported unusual contacts, but they offered no theories. No investigations were announced, no follow-up studies were conducted. This silence struck many observers as strange. If these objects represented foreign incursion into American waters, the response should have been swift and public. If they were simply natural phenomena or equipment errors, why classify the reports? The lack of reaction suggested something more complex was at play. Commercial fishermen working out of San Pedro and Long Beach began reporting more activity around the same time. Crews described seeing glowing objects beneath their boats, sometimes following them for hours before turning toward deeper water. Some fishermen said their electronic gear broke when the objects were nearby. Radios would fill with static. GPS systems would lose signal, and depth finders would show impossible readings. One captain described his depth finder showing the ocean floor at 1,200 feet, then seconds later reading 8,000 feet, then returning to 1,200 feet, all while his boat stayed in the same spot. He believed something large had passed beneath his boat, confusing the sonar. Sometimes military personnel would see the objects from shore. In 1991, a Marine at Camp Pendleton was on night watch overlooking the Pacific. He saw 3 glowing spheres rise from the water about 2 miles offshore. The spheres hovered in a triangle shape for several minutes, then they shot up fast into the sky and disappeared. The Marine filed a report, but was told the objects were likely flares from a naval exercise. He stayed unconvinced. He noted that flares do not rise from beneath the ocean's surface, or speed up vertically at the speeds he saw. The sightings were not limited to military and commercial watchers. Civilian witnesses reported their own meetings, often recreational boaters and surfers. In 1996, a group of surfers waiting for waves near Malibu watched a dark, disc-shaped object come up from the water about 100 yards offshore. The object hovered briefly, dripping water. Before tilting on its side and shooting upward into the cloudy sky, the surfers guessed the disc was roughly 40 feet across. One of them managed to capture a few seconds of shaky video on a handheld camera. The footage, later posted online, shows something rising from the water, but the quality is too poor to show details. Skeptics claim it could be anything from a whale to a piece of trash. The surfers insist they know what they saw. By the early 2000s, better tools allowed for better records. Digital cameras, night vision gear, and more advanced sonar systems captured data that earlier witnesses could only describe. In 2004, the USS Nimitz carrier group ran into multiple unknown objects during training exercises off the coast of San Diego. The event, which became known as the Nimitz encounter, involved both aerial and underwater objects. Pilots engaged what they described as tic-tac-shaped craft. These craft showed flight abilities beyond any known aircraft. Less talked about was the fact that sonar operators on the ships picked up matching underwater contacts. The objects in the water seemed to mirror the movements of the aerial craft. This suggested they were working together. The Nimitz event got a lot of attention when details were leaked to the media years later. Former Navy personnel came forward to describe what they had seen. Commander David Fravor, one of the pilots involved, spoke publicly about engaging an object that outflew his FA-18 Super Hornet. But the underwater part got less focus. Sonar logs from the meeting showed objects beneath the surface, matching speeds with the aerial craft above. When the aerial object would stop and hover, the underwater contact would also stop. When the aerial object sped up, the submerged contact would speed up together. The meaning was clear. The objects were working together, maybe talking, using tools that allowed smooth operation in both air and water. Other events followed the Nimitz meeting. In 2008, fishermen off Catalina Island reported a tube-shaped object, maybe 50 feet long. It surfaced near their boat around midnight. The object was dark, gray, or black. No visible marks. It hovered above the water for about 30 seconds before going under. The fishermen described a humming sound during the meeting, low and deep. They felt it in their chests more than heard it with their ears. After the object left, their radio stopped working for the rest of the night. They returned to port the next morning and reported the meeting to the Coast Guard, which logged the event but offered no explanation. As sightings piled up, patterns showed up that researchers found hard to ignore. The objects seemed to favor certain depths and places. The Santa Catalina Channel and the waters around San Clemente Island showed the most activity. Objects were rarely seen in shallow water. This suggested they needed depth for whatever they were doing. Most sightings happened during periods of low moonlight. When the ocean surface was darker, this suggested the objects liked to work unobserved, or at least with less visibility. Clemente Island showed the highest concentration of activity. Objects were rarely seen in shallow water, suggesting they required depth for whatever operations they conducted. Most sightings occurred during periods of low moon illumination, when the ocean's surface was darker. This suggested the objects preferred to operate unobserved, or at least with reduced visibility, the tools shown by the objects remain the most puzzling part. Witnesses always reported silent operation, even when the objects moved at high speed. This went against everything known about movement physics. Movement through water makes noise, especially at high speeds. Bubbles alone should create a roar you could hear for miles. Yet these objects moved in silence, or near silence. This suggested movement methods that did not rely on normal thrust. Some researchers said the objects used some form of field movement, working with gravity or magnetic fields to move through water without physical contact. Such tools would explain the lack of noise and the absence of visible exhaust or wake. The smooth change between water and air presented another puzzle. When aircraft enter water at speed, they usually break apart or sink. When submarines surface, they create big disturbance. The objects seen off California seem to change between elements without trouble, keeping their shape and control. In 2012, a Coast Guard helicopter crew watched an object exit the water near Point Conception. It hovered briefly, then sped up vertically until it vanished from sight. The whole event took less than 10 seconds. The crew described minimal water movement, as though the object had not been traveling through liquid at all. Some witnesses reported even more troubling details. In 2015, a Navy sonar expert aboard a destroyer doing exercises southwest of San Diego picked up a huge contact on passive sonar. The object was guessed to be over 300 feet long, far larger than any submarine in service. It was sitting still at a depth of about 1,800 feet. The expert watched the contact for nearly an hour before it began to move, rising slowly toward the surface. As it rose, smaller contacts showed up around it, maybe a dozen objects, each roughly 30 to 40 feet long. The smaller objects moved on their own, circling the larger one in what looked like a planned pattern. Then, without warning, all contacts sped up fast and disappeared off the sonar. The expert reported the event to his bosses but got no feedback. The idea of underwater bases came back to the front of guessing. If the objects were using the California coast as a work area, they needed buildings. Bases would explain the repeated sightings in the same places. They would give a logical reason for the objects to enter and exit the water, rather than simply flying over. Some researchers suggested that the bases might be mobile, huge submarine-like motherships that moved along the coast and sent out smaller craft as needed. Others believed the bases were fixed setups, built into the rock walls of underwater valleys, where they would be invisible to surface watching. In 2017, reports came out of unusual sonar readings near the San Clemente Basin. Several fishing boats picked up what their gear read as large, hollow structures on the ocean floor, at depths over 3,500 feet. The readings did not match known rock shapes. One captain described his sonar showing what looked like a series of domes or spheres arranged in a grid pattern. When he tried to mark the location for later checking, his GPS system broke. He could not return to the exact spot. Other fishermen reported similar experiences. This suggested either gear failure or planned interference. The official response to the mystery has been steady: silence. The Navy sometimes admits that personnel have reported meetings with unidentified objects, but it offers no explanations. When pressed, spokespeople suggest the objects might be foreign tools, maybe drones or test craft from enemy nations. This explanation satisfies few researchers. If a foreign power had tools able to work underwater at such speeds and depths, it would be a threat that the United States could not ignore. Yet there is no proof of any such response, no increased patrols, no heightened alert status, no public warnings. The silence suggests either the military does not view the objects as a threat, or it knows something it has chosen not to share. Civilian researchers have tried to check the waters off California on their own, but the challenges are huge. Deep ocean exploring requires expensive gear and special ships. The areas of greatest interest lie within military exercise zones, making access hard or impossible. Even when researchers get permission to survey certain places, they face technical problems. Gear breaks often. Sonar returns become unreliable. GPS systems lose accuracy. Some investigators believe this is planned, that the objects have the ability to mess with human tools. Others blame the problems on natural events, underwater rock features that create magnetic oddities and sonar tricks. A handful of researchers have managed to collect interesting data. In 2019, a private trip using a deep-tow sonar system surveyed parts of the Santa Catalina Channel. The team picked up several odd returns, structures that looked man-made in their shape. The data showed smooth, flat surfaces and right angles, not matching natural rock shapes. When the team tried to send down a robot sub to capture visual proof, the robot lost communication after going below 2,000 feet. It was eventually recovered, but its cameras had stopped recording, and its memory was corrupted. The team could not tell if the failure was accidental or the result of outside interference. Witnesses keep coming forward. In recent years, smartphone cameras and better night vision tools have allowed ordinary people to record meetings that previous generations could only describe. Videos appear online showing lights beneath the water, objects rising from the surface, and craft that speed up beyond the frame before the camera can focus. Skeptics argue that most of these videos show nothing more than boats, aircraft, or natural events wrongly identified in poor lighting. But some footage fights easy explanation. Objects that move too fast, too silently, or in ways that break physics as we understand it. The question remains unanswered. Are there bases beneath the Pacific off California? If so, who built them? The most simple explanation would be foreign submarines, maybe Chinese or Russian, using the deep valleys to spy on American naval activities. But this theory falls apart under looking. The sightings come from before the Cold War. The tools shown exceed anything in any nation's known military. The objects change between air and water, something no submarine can do. Others say secret American projects, black budget programs testing strange movement systems in the deep ocean, where they can work away from prying eyes. This would explain the military's unwillingness to look openly. If the objects are ours, admitting them would give away classified research. But this theory also has weaknesses. The sightings span decades. Coming before many advanced tools, witnesses include military personnel, who would likely be briefed if they were meeting friendly assets. The objects have been seen globally, not just off California, suggesting an origin beyond any single nation's military-industrial complex. That leaves the explanation most witnesses arrive at slowly. The objects are not human. They show tools from somewhere else, operated by minds with motives we can only guess. Maybe they are watching us, studying human civilization from the hiding of the deep ocean. Maybe they have been here far longer than we realize, coming before our own arrival on this planet. The Chumash spoke of beings from the Channel waters. Spanish explorers wrote about lights beneath their ships. Every generation has seen them, described them in the language and context of their time. The Pacific off California remains as mysterious now as it was centuries ago. Fishing boats still report lights beneath the surface. Sonar operators still track contacts that move too fast. Pilots still see objects entering and exiting the water. And researchers still wonder what lies in the valleys and canyons.